Hello everybody, welcome to the stream. We're going to talk about parallel Ashcan tonight. We'll get started once, give people a chance to arrive, and then we'll start talking about the latest parallel investigator that was announced for the game just on Friday. Much to certainly my surprise. I'm sure other players were as surprised as I was, considering that it's been pretty quiet from FFG on the Arkham horror front of late. There was that one announcement about the upcoming standalone investigator at that'll be debuting at Gen Con, I believe, but no new information about the next set or anything like that. So the fact that they decided to release a new parallel investigator is welcome. Hi, Alarine, welcome to the stream. Glad you could make it. So yes, Ash, of the 5 Dunwich investigators, they decided to go with Ashcan first. As you may remember, when they released the first batch of parallel investigators, they started off with Daisy, and so this time they decided to go with Ashcan. Had some mixed feelings about it, considering that Ashcan is among the better solo investigators in the game, and so I think the new this new Ashcan lends itself more to multiplayer, but we'll take a look at what options are available to him. Certainly saying goodbye, or at least shuffling Duke into your draw deck rather than starting the game with Duke on the table is tough. I think some people play Ashcan. They're playing Duke more than they are playing Ashcan. So the fact that Duke is not around, at least immediately, if you wish to go that way, will be a bit of a setback for some. It'll be interesting to see if we do receive any more parallel investigators from the Dunwich Legacy, and what those investigators do. If I had to guess, I would like to think that Rex Murphy will have something to do with curses. That would be, I think, fitting for his particular character. Just like Wendy was sort of the curse / bless investigator, and Father Mateo is sort of the bless investigator. I think it makes sense if Rex was the curse investigator. And then, of course, we've got Jenny. Who else is there? Who's the cook's name? My memory's slipping here. So we've got, Jim is another one. That might be interesting to see. We've got Zoe, Jenny, Rex, Ashcan, and Jim, I think, as the 5 of them. We'll just wait a few more minutes, and then we'll dive into Ashcan Pete. Spent the weekend looking over his deck options. We're primarily going to focus on Ashcan as the new parallel version. I think the old version of Ashcan with Duke and Racked by Nightmares is pretty well known. So it'll be should be interesting. Looking forward to hearing what people in the chat have to say about Ashcan Pete, and whether he is going to be any good or not. Ashcan does get a couple of replacement signatures as opposed to his regular cards. Alarine asks, so Game Center won't print these anymore. I don't know what what Game Center is going to do. I think they're sort of loosely affiliated with FFG. I didn't happen to get in on the first batch of Parallel Investigators, so which isn't too bad considering I don't really play physical cards all that often. So if I want to play them, I can always play them on Octagon or Tabletop Simulator. Don't have any idea whether they're going to print these ones once all 5 are released, if all 5 are released. I think it is also noteworthy that the last 5 investigators came with their own scenario. Ashcan Pete is not so lucky. Not sure whether that has something to do with just the lack of manpower at FFG or whatnot. Maybe the amount of development that went into those scenarios just took too much time, and they can't afford to spend that time developing individual scenarios for investigators. But Ashcan doesn't get his own challenge scenario, but then again, he doesn't get his own advanced signature cards either, unlike the other 5 investigators who we saw previously. The designers decided against providing upgrades for Duke and Racked by Nightmares, probably because if you did provide an upgraded version of Duke, it would probably be busted, because Duke is already pretty damn good. And so I suspect maybe they played around with it a little bit and tried various advanced versions of Duke and decided that they couldn't come up with one that wasn't too busted, and so they decided to tear a page out of the novellas and go with the replacement signatures instead. So Pete gets his guitar at last, and he also gets a new weakness, Hard Times, which we'll take a look at here in a minute or two. I hope everybody had a great weekend and is having a great summer. I had a great vacation with my family. We spent a couple weeks touring Japan, which was pretty awesome. Very hot there. Could feel the sweat streaming down my back most days. Fortunately, the weather cooperated, so we had a very good vacation. So I'm looking forward to seeing some more Arkham Horror news. Hopefully, maybe there'll be something out of Gen Con. Gen Con starts, I believe, next Thursday, Wednesday or Thursday. So maybe FFG will have some information about the next set then. That would be pretty nice. Otherwise, we'll just have to keep our fingers crossed. So we are going to, without further ado, let's dive into Ashcan Pete, the Parallel Investigator. So just a quick reminder of how the Parallel Investigator rules work. When you're building an Ashcan Pete deck, you may choose whether to use the original version or the parallel version of both his front side and his back side. Each version has its own advantages and disadvantages. You can also mix and match the 2 versions, which means that you can use both original sides, both parallel sides, the original front and the parallel back, or the parallel front and the original back. So you have a lot of different options to build an Ashcan Pete deck these days. You can either start with Duke in play or not, depending whether you go original or parallel. And Ashcan Pete's deck building restrictions also change on his backside. So depending whether you want Ashcan to have access to all of the card pool at level 0, or whether you just want him to be a little more restricted, say focus on improvised and tactics and guardian cards, but we will look at those in a moment. So here are the original and parallel versions of Ashcan Pete, the Drifter. The original version should should be well known at this point. He has 4 willpower, 2 intellect, 2 combat, and 3 agility. Drifter trait, you begin the game with Duke in play. As a free triggered ability, discard a card from your hand to ready an asset you control, limit once per round. Usually that ability is used to ready Duke. I don't think I have ever used that ability to ready another asset. And his Elder Sign effect is +2, and you get to ready Duke. The original Ashcan has 6 health and 5 sanity to start with because, of course, Duke starts in play, which gives him some soak on the table right away. Now, the parallel version of Ashcan Pete changes things up a little bit. He has the same sanity, intellect, and agility, and his combat gets a little boost up to 3 rather than 2. He still has the drifter trait. You begin the game with Pete's guitar in play, and we'll take a look at Pete's guitar in a moment. As a response, when a card you own that is attached to a scenario card would be discarded, add it to your hand instead, limit once per round. So this card interacts with a lot of the cards that we have seen over the years at this point that either attach to enemies or generally enemies or locations are what these cards attach to. A lot of these cards have been hit or miss over the years, so going all the way back to Barricade in the core set, and we have received a smattering of them over the sets, but some of them tend to be very good, and others tend to be somewhat mediocre. If you have been watching our reviews of the player cards in the Path to Carcosa Investigator expansion, we've talked, I'm not sure how at length we talked about Ambush, but it is one of those cards that you can attach to a location to deal 2 damage to an enemy that spawns at that location. We didn't have a lot of good things to say about Ambush, and so Pete's new response will interact with cards like Barricade, Ambush, there's On the Hunt level 3, and a whole bunch of other cards that we will take a look at a little bit later in the stream. So this is an attempt, I guess, to bring those cards, make them a little better. It is noteworthy, though, that if you are playing this version of the front side of Ashcan, Duke does not start in play. You start with his guitar instead. Duke will, you can play Duke in the deck, but Duke will start in your draw deck, and you will have to play him the hard way. Ashcan Pete's Elder Sign effect is +1, and choose a card you own attached to a scenario card. You may return the chosen card to your hand. There are quite a few of the cards that attach to scenario cards that don't discard easily. They only discard if the location leaves play, which honestly doesn't happen all that often unless the board, unless you're tearing down the map. And some of them attach to enemies, and the only way that card will be discarded is if that enemy is discarded by killing it. Although some of the cards that you're attaching to it sort of nullify that enemy anyway, so you're not likely to go out of your way to kill the enemy after you've attached a card to it, but not always. And so Ashcan's Elder Sign effect gives him a way of sort of removing those attached cards early and bringing them back to his hand so that he can play them. Finally, the parallel version of Ashcan Pete starts with 7 health and 7 sanity, so 2 more sanity than his original version, and 1 more stamina or health. The parallel version of Ashcan reminds me a lot, at least the front side of William Yorick from the Path to Carcosa Investigator expansion. The primary difference between them is that Ashcan has the 4 in willpower and a 3 in combat, and Yorick has a 3 in willpower and a 4 in combat. The rest of their stats are the same. Yorick's ability lets you return cards from your discard pile, I believe. So same sort of, the new Ashcan has the same sort of recursion effect that has become commonplace among survivors. So the designers are certainly sticking to the color pie in this case. But certainly Ashcan having 7 health and 7 sanity is very, very nice. That's a lot of soak. And then if you decide to play Duke in the deck, that gives you even more, plus your ally on top of that. So he's got quite a bit to help you get through a scenario. Now the backsides of Ashcan Pete, we have the original and parallel here. The original deck size 30, deck building options, survivor cards level 0 to 5, neutral cards level 0 to 5, up to 5 level 0 cards from any other class. And his deck building requirements include Duke, Racked by Nightmares, and 1 random basic weakness. So the original version of Ashcan has, you can choose any 5 cards from the level 0 card pool to include in his deck, which led to a lot of diversity in Ashcan Pete builds. I've seen, I think, cards from all classes show up in Ashcan Pete builds. If you want to, he's one of the few investigators who can take talents to cover off all his skills. So I've seen things, what is it, Arcane Studies, I think I've seen in his deck. I've seen things like the cancellation card. So there's lots of different options in the old Ashcan Pete. Now the new Ashcan Pete, same deck size, survivor cards level 0 to 3. Now this removes level 4 and 5 survivor cards from Ashcan Pete's pool. Not that that means a whole lot. I think there are, if I counted correctly, there are only 8 cards, 8 survivor cards that are level 4 and 5. That includes Chainsaw level 4, Deja Vu level 5, Dig Deep level 4, Earthly Serenity level 4, both versions of the Precious Memento from a former life and from a future life, Quick Learner, and Sledgehammer 4. So limiting the new Ashcan's survivor cards to level 0 to 3 doesn't really impact him all that much. The only card there that I might want might be Sledgehammer. The others, maybe Chainsaw, like the big weapons, if you decide to go sort of really lean into the new Ashcan's sort of guardian abilities and make him a big fighter. Having access to Chainsaw and Sledgehammer would be pretty nice. Those are very high level weapons. And since Ashcan can't take high level guardian weapons, as we'll see, he's sort of limited in that regard. So maybe losing out on those is a bit of a problem, but of course there's always neutral options. So I don't know how much Ashcan will miss those survivor cards. His other deck building options include improvised and tactic cards level 0 to 4. Now, all of the cards with the improvised trait are survivor cards level 0 to 3 anyway. So he's not gaining, I don't think he's gaining a single card from another class with the improvised trait. So that really doesn't do a whole lot right now. Tactic cards, however, there are quite a few tactic cards level 0 to 4 in other classes, and there are quite a few that are of interest to Ashcan. Of course, you've got real powerhouses, which were the ones I was looking at. There's cards like Dynamite Blast. That's a nice pickup for Ashcan. There's Elusive, if you're playing non-taboo Elusive, that's pretty sweet. You've got both versions of Ever Vigilant, if you want to get a little bit of a head start in your setup. Unfortunately, Ashcan cannot take stick to the plan, so he would have to draw Ever Vigilant the hard way, but as we said in our review of Ever Vigilant recently in the Guardian reviews, it may often be worthwhile just to pack that in your deck anyway, because it does give you such a huge boost on setup. Some of the other tactics that stood out to me include First Watch, if you want to play around with the encounter deck a little bit. Hiding Spot is a good one that we'll see. There's the level 3 version of On the Hunt, I think works pretty well. If you build your deck a certain way and include lots of skills with the practice trait, Practice Makes Perfect is a tactic. So you can include that in your deck. Hi, Kodab, welcome to the stream. Glad you could make it. So if you have enough skills with the practice trait, Practice Makes Perfect is a tactic. Of course, Prepared for the Worst. There are two versions of that, the level 0 version and the level 2 version. If Pete wants to go hunting for a weapon. Shortcut is a tactic as well, so you can give Pete a little bit of extra movement. A lot of the others, there's like cards like Sneak Attack, Snipes, Weaken Kick, Swift Reload might be interesting if you're playing a gun deck. And then, are there any others? Let's see, there's Guardian that he could take. Practice Makes Perfect. Kicking the Hornet's Nest, I think we had good things to say about that when we did our review in the Scarlet Keys. And but yeah, there's how many tactics are there in the game right now? There's like 80 plus tactics, and there are some very powerful options, but then there's a lot that Pete probably doesn't care much about. I've got a plan, for example. Pete's not going to give a damn about that. He's not going to be using his intellect to attack anything. So there's cards like, of course, Backstab, but I don't see Pete decks using Backstab. Barricade is a very interesting one, which we will take a look at later, especially the level 3 version. That one, I think, has a lot of potential to do some good work in a Pete deck. So there are a few very powerful tactics that Pete would be interested in, but there's also quite a few that I don't think we'll see any play in a Pete deck. Now, in addition to cards, improvised tactic cards level 0 to 4, he can include neutral cards level 0 to 5 and up to 5 other Guardian cards level 0. So once you pick up your improvised cards and tactics, quite a few tactic cards are Guardian cards, so they will not count against that 5 Guardian card limit. And then you get to pick 5 other Guardian cards, which, much like the original version, who can only take 5 other level 0 cards from any class, 5 Guardian cards is not a whole lot. And as I sat down to try to build a solo deck with the new Ashcan, choosing those 5 Guardian cards was a pretty tough decision. There are an awful lot of very, very good Guardian cards. I mean, if you just take 2 copies of Vicious Blow right off the bat, you're already down to only 3 options at that point. So there is a lot of competition for those 5 Guardian card slots. His other deck building requirements are the same: Duke, Racked by Nightmares, 1 random basic weakness. So the new Ashcan is Survivor / Guardian with a smattering of tactics from potentially other classes, although most tactics are still Guardian cards. So he is yet another Survivor Guardian. We have a couple of those already. We've got William York, who is, of course, Survivor and Guardian up to level 2 Guardian cards. And then we have Daniela from the Edge of the Earth, who starts off as a Guardian and swaps to Survivor. So if you're interested in playing the red-blue combination, you have a couple of different options at this point for investigators. I wanted to talk about Ashcan's replacement signature cards as well. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the stream, the past parallel investigators received advanced signature cards, which means you could upgrade their signature cards once you earn some XP. The designers took one look at Duke and decided, well, we're not going to be able to design an advanced version of Duke that is going to work. I bet they probably played around with the idea, and maybe they just couldn't find a version that wasn't busted and would be just too good. I honestly don't know what you could do to improve on Duke. I mean, he's already the best ally in the game, and so any ability you tacked on to his level 0 version would just make him so beyond belief good that the designers decided not to go that route. Instead, they tapped the novellas and decided to offer replacement signature cards instead. So the rules for replacement signature cards, of course, are you've got, regardless of which version of Ashcan Pete you use, you may also include his replacement signature cards. These are included only as a set. So if you choose to use Pete's guitar, you must also use Hard Times, which is the signature weakness that pairs with that. If you cannot decide which set of signature cards to use, you're welcome to include both sets in your deck, which I think is actually, considering the value of Duke as an ally, I think that's a pretty good way to go if you're willing to swallow having two signature weaknesses in your deck. I think adding Duke to your deck isn't a bad option. Let's take a look at those signatures. Of course, the original, we have Duke. What can we say about Duke that hasn't been said already? He's a loyal hound, and amazing. The amount of action compression that Duke provides is unparalleled in the game. The fact that you can discard a card to ready Duke and get even more actions out of him on a turn makes Ashcan, without a doubt, one of the best solo investigators in the game. Have a good night, Alarine. Thanks for dropping by. And yeah, so Pete and Duke is a formidable duo, especially in solo and multiplayer as well. And if I am having trouble with a scenario in solo, usually pairing Pete and Duke is enough to beat that scenario, and sometimes trivialize the scenario. If you're struggling with one investigator, switching to Duke and Pete is often can radically change how that scenario plays. And of course, Duke's power is from the fact that he starts on the table. You don't have to go looking for him. He starts in play immediately. However, if you want to play with the new parallel side of Ashcan Pete, you're going to have to surrender Duke for Pete's guitar, still holding up. It has the item and instrument trait, costs 2 resources. Ashcan Pete deck only replacement trait, or replacement keyword, I guess it would be. Now, Pete's guitar does start in play, so you don't have to worry about paying its resource cost unless it somehow ends up getting discarded, which certainly it could. It is an asset, so it is. You can get hit by Crypt Chill with it, and I guess in certain scenarios, Crypt Chill could take your guitar out on the first turn. So certainly there is a way for your guitar to have to pay for it the hard way. Now, the guitar's ability is a free triggered ability. Exhaust Pete's guitar, choose a non-elite enemy at your location or a connecting location. Move that enemy once in a direction of your choice. Then, if there are no enemies at your location, either heal 1 horror or gain 1 resource. So Duke provides a ton of action compression. You're sacrificing that in favor of an enemy management tool, which also sort of generates extra healing and resources if you pull it off right. I do like how Pete's guitar synergizes with some of the cards we're going to look at in a moment, the ones that attach to locations and block enemies, because if you can sort of set up a barricade, for example, block the enemies from getting to you, Pete plays a little ditty on his guitar and then can move that enemy away to another further away from that location, and then presumably there are no enemies at your location, so you can heal a horror or gain a resource. And considering that Ashcan already has 7 sanity, that little bit of horror healing can go a long way. And the fact that it is a free triggered ability, I always like free triggered abilities that heal way better than taking actions to heal, and so having that little extra horror is good. Now, I don't think you should sleep on gaining a resource either. I think one of the interesting decisions you're going to have to make as you're building an Ashcan Pete deck is that survivors tend to be able to run on very few resources because a lot of their cards don't cost a whole lot to begin with. So sort of once you get your board set up, you can sort of ride the trickle of resources that you're gaining each turn. And really, it's no surprise that you've got a card like Madame Lebranche from the Path to Carcosa Investigator expansion who fits into Ashcan Pete decks, because he sort of spends down all of his resources and then you can trigger Madame Lebranche to gain a resource. The new Ashcan, or the parallel Ashcan, is leaning a little heavier into first Guardian, which has more expensive cards, and also if you want to play some of these cards that attach themselves to other things, all of those cards have a cost, or at least most of them do. So on the face of it, it's nice that parallel Pete's ability allows you to get those cards back into your hand, but then you've also got to pay for them again. So if you're able to generate a few extra resources with Pete's guitar, I think that will go a long way to making the deck run a lot more smoothly. And I think it's also worth noting that survivors tend not to have a ton of resource generation to begin with. There's the one skill, the name escapes me at the moment, that you can generate some resources with. But typically, if you want resource generation, you have to go with emergency cash or something like that, because they just don't have a ton in class, such as, between that and drawn, they don't really have either of those things. They're compensated for that by having sort of very cheap cards and ways of getting cards back from their discard pile. They tend not to have draw or resource gain. So being able to play a little solo on Pete's guitar and generate a resource should be very nice. It's great that they made it that you get to choose a non-elite enemy at your location or a connecting location. So if an enemy doesn't happen to be on your location, you still have there is still a way to trigger this thing. And of course, if you draw an enemy during the Mythos phase and it happens to engage with you, you can take a free triggered ability, use the free triggered ability on Pete's guitar right away, and send that enemy to a connecting location. And if that non-elite enemy isn't a hunter, then you've probably dealt with it for at least that turn, and possibly the entire game, and you've gained a resource to boot. So that is pretty nice. So Pete's guitar is no Duke, of course. Duke stands alone, but I think that considering the deck that you are going to be playing with Parallel Pete and attaching these events to locations and trying to manipulate how enemies move on the board, I think Pete's Guitar is a nice addition to that deck, and the fact that it's a free triggered ability is just icing on the cake. Of course, you don't get Pete's Guitar without suffering some a signature weakness. Now, Ashcan's original signature weakness, of course, is Racked by Nightmares. Exhaust all assets you control and put Racked by Nightmares into play in your threat area. Assets you control cannot ready. Take 2 actions, discard Racked by Nightmares. This thing is can be absolutely brutal if you draw it at the wrong time. It exhausts Pete and your guns and pretty much anything else that you were hoping to rely upon to deal with enemies. And so taking the 2 actions to get rid of Racked by Nightmares when you are being ganged up on by a bunch of enemies can be very, very painful. It always seems to hit me at just the worst time, and usually when I have a bunch of enemies I have to deal with, and suddenly I pull this, Duke gets exhausted, my guns get exhausted, everything is exhausted, and then you got to figure your way out of that mess. And the original Ashcan Pete has less strength than the parallel version, so it's going to be hard to fight his way out of that. Now, the new signature weakness is Hard Times. It has the Hardship trait. I believe that's the first time that trait has appeared on a card. Ashcan Pete deck only replacement. Put Hard Times into play in your threat area forced after you draw 1 or more cards. Choose and discard that many cards from hand. And it takes 2 actions in order to discard, which is pretty, at this point in the game's lifespan, most signature weaknesses cost 2 actions or the equivalent of 2 actions to get rid of, so no surprise there. This one, it's a little hard for me to judge how painful this would be without having played it yet, but you're going to draw a card every turn, and so basically you're going to draw a card and then discard a card. So you're not necessarily, your hand's not going to dwindle, but you're not going to build up your hand if your hand is low. And of course, if you do end up in a situation where you have, say, if you've got 8 cards, I think this one is similar to it reminds me actually of Harvey Walters, his weakness a little bit. I think his is if you have a duplicate in your hand or something like that. So if you have a flush hand of 8 cards, drawing a card and then picking one of those 8 cards to discard, you could probably play around this one fairly easily, especially if it's late game and you've only got a few turns left and you don't want to sacrifice the 2 actions to get rid of this. You can probably play around it. But if this thing hits at the wrong time and you're low on your hand size is, less than 4 or something like that, or you just don't have a lot of cards to work with and you're under pressure, this thing could really bite, and you're going to want to take those 2 actions to get rid of it. At least it's just 2 actions. So if you're playing multiplayer and you draw this, chances are you'll just get rid of it at the first opportunity. But if you're playing in solo like I do most of the time, and you're sort of pressing to the end and you want to finish the game and you've got enough cards in your hand, then you might be able to play around this one to a certain extent. So certainly not the worst weakness in the world, and it's fairly straightforward to get rid of. But of course, if you want to include Duke, continue to include Duke in your parallel Ashcan decks, then you're going to need to play Racked by Nightmares as well. And so that taxing yourself 4 actions per game is could get pretty steep if both of these things, if you happen to draw both of them during one game. So we are going to take a closer look at some of the cards that you can include in the parallel Ashcan Pete deck. Primarily the improvised and tactic cards. Now, there are a great number of tactics. We went over some of them earlier. I'm not going to rehash all the various tactics that you could include in an Ashcan Pete deck, but I do want to focus on some of the tactics that work well with Ashcan Pete's response. That being, when one of those cards attached to a scenario card would be discarded, you can add it to your hand instead. Now, there's quite a few of those cards that would be of interest to Ashcan Pete. There are also, and I did build a solo deck that we'll take a look at the end, and if we have enough time, we'll also give it a whirl here and see how it plays. There are, as I was building the solo deck, it is, solo deck doesn't really, I don't think, gives you a very good impression of sort of the tricks that this new parallel Ashcan Pete deck can pull, primarily because when you are playing in solo, you're usually very focused. Like, you've got a few things you got to do. You got to be able to deal with enemies. You got to be able to discover clues. And so by the time you fill your deck with cards that let you deal with enemies and discovers clues, there's just not a lot of room for tricksy stuff. I did try to include a few different tricks in my Ashcan Pete deck, but I think this parallel investigator will really lend itself more to multiplayer play, where you can really sort of explore those cards in a little bit greater detail. Now, the fact that Ashcan here is leading or leaning more into Guardian, you can certainly make, and he has 7 health and 7 sanities. He can tank a hit or two, so you could certainly build a sort of a more support, I think, type of Ashcan Pete deck that actually plays quite a bit differently from your typical support Guardian, who may be there, to say, tackle some enemies on one turn, maybe heal other investigators at the table with those cards that let them take damage and horror for other investigators at the table, stuff like that. This Ashcan, or parallel Ashcan, I think, can play a support role in a slightly different way by using these cards that attach to scenario cards. So I'd like to take a look at some of those now. So I think the one that is one of the most interesting cards for an Ashcan Pete or parallel Ashcan Pete deck, and if I forget to say parallel from now on, just assume I'm talking about the parallel version, both front and back, is Makeshift Trap, which was a customizable card that was released in the Scarlet Keys Investigator expansion. Just as a quick reminder, it's a 1-cost event with intellect and agility skill icons, improvised and trap trait, customizable, uses 2 time. If Makeshift Trap has no time, you can discard it, attach it to your location. Each non-elite enemy at attached location gets -1 fight and -1 evade. Forced at the end of the round, remove 1 time from Makeshift Trap. So the fact that Parallel Ashcan can recycle the Makeshift Trap every time it's discarded sort of turns it into a recurable event that he can constantly have on his location for if he's willing to spend the action to play it. Now, one of the ideas I had was that if you pick up in the thick of it, I know that there's pretty much every deck can take in the thick of it and find something to spend that 3 XP on. And I think if you spend some of that XP on picking up the simple upgrade for Makeshift Trap, that being Makeshift Trap gains fast and play during any free triggered ability window, basically you've got a card that Ashcan Pete can play down anytime he wants. If he's got an enemy near him, that enemy immediately gets -1 fight and -1 evade. Again, has to be non-elite, but non-elite enemies are fairly common. And the fact that it subtracts from their fight value. So if you are, say, you get a typical rats, that will drop it down to a zero fight enemy, and then basically you can kill it very, very easily. Now, Parallel Ashcan only has 3 combat, so I think this -1 fight, 3 combat and 3 agility, to come to think of it. So this -1 fight and -1 evade sort of helps him in that regard and gives him a leg up. You pick up Simple to make it play during any free triggered ability window for fast, and you've got a nice way of slapping this thing down on the table while an enemy's at your location, letting the time tick down, and then when it's discarded, you pull it back to your hand, and then later in the game you can play it down again and get the benefit once again. Now, if you really want to play around with Makeshift Trap, you could also spend a little bit of XP on Improved Timer, so you can increase or decrease its uses by 1. So if you want to recycle the trap quicker, you decrease its uses. So basically, you play the trap at the end of the round, it will tick down almost immediately and discard itself, so it pops back to your hand, so it's not sitting on the table. Say you play it down, you kill the enemy, the trap's just sitting there. At the end of the round, it bounces back. You don't have to wait. Or if you think you've got a long slog ahead of you, you could certainly increase its uses by time and keep it on the table for longer. Say if you were in a boss battle or something like that, and you want to, the boss may have, you want to keep tabs on any other non-elite enemies that may show up at your location, it may be worthwhile just to keep the trap down on the table for a little bit longer so Pete can deal with those. Now, Makeshift Trap has all sorts of other upgrades available. For 1 XP, you can pick up Tripwire, so you only trigger Makeshift Trap's forced ability if there are 1 or more enemies at attached location. So basically causing the timer to stop, which could work with some of the other things, some of the other upgrades. You've got Poisonous. When you remove time from Makeshift Trap, you can deal a damage to an enemy at attached location. So if something is sticking around, you can damage it. Now, it's worth noting that you can deal damage to any enemy at attached location, including enemies with the aloof keyword. So if you've got some of those annoying whippoorwills hanging around, Poisonous will poison the air and take care of them nicely. You've got Remote Configuration for 2 XP, which when you play the trap, you can attach it to a revealed connecting location. Again, this sort of works with Pete's, the free triggered ability on Pete's guitar, so you can push enemies in to that connecting location from your location. And or you can pull them into I guess you can pull them into the trap if necessary. And if they start at your location and you push them away into the trap, which is at another location, you're going to heal a horror, gain resources, which is awfully nice. You've got the net, which non-elite enemies at attached location cannot move or make attacks of opportunity. That's pretty nice, especially if there are several enemies that are engaged with other investigators at your location. Suddenly your seekers can continue to investigate without fear of being attacked and stuff like that. So now I think net actually doesn't work well with Pete's guitar, because Pete's guitar wants you to move an enemy, and this says non-elites cannot move. So that's something to be careful of if you're building a deck with Pete's guitar and the Makeshift Trap, that net and that don't necessarily jive well together. And finally, for 4 XP, you have Explosive Device. When Makeshift Trap has no time and is discarded, deal 3 damage to each enemy and an investigator at attached location. So this makes a nice combo with Pete's guitar. If you pick up the remote configuration, drop the Makeshift Trap on a connecting location, use Pete's guitar to serenade the non-elite enemy, pushing it into the trap's location, and then setting off the explosion, killing it and hopefully other enemies at that location. So I think Makeshift Trap is one of those cards that if you're willing to pick up something like In the Thick of It for the simple upgrade right off the bat, and then you can sort of build out the trap from there as you gain more experience. You can go, for a combination of remote configuration, explosive device, poisonous, depending on your build. I think that makes this one of the more versatile attach cards that is in Ashcan Pete's arsenal. It's also nice that it only costs 1 resource, which, as we shall see, is not the case with some of the other attached to cards that are available. The other card that really stood out to me as I was looking through the various tactics that attach to cards is Barricade. Now, Barricade level 0, it's not as interesting as its level 3 counterpart. I think the first thing I want to point out about this thing is that it's free. So Ashcan can play this for an action. When an investigator leaves the attached location, he can bounce it back to his hand and then replay it for an action. So you're only losing the action. You're not spending resources. So if Ashcan has weapons and allies and whatnot to play, having a free card that attaches to locations that he can recycle is a big boon. Now, level 0 Barricade, it just says non-elite enemies cannot move into attached location. Now that can be sort of effective in early scenarios, say, especially I think if you're playing in multiplayer and sort of your group is huddled up together, Ashcan can take one action to slap down this barricade, and now you've got your non-elite hunters that can't enter that location. That's okay. Now, if you spend the 3 XP or 6 XP if you want 2 copies to upgrade to level 3 Barricade, I think this is when it really starts to get good, because especially if your group is huddled up together. So you huddle up at a location right before the Mythos phase. Ashcan drops this on the location. During the subsequent Mythos phase, if you're playing 4 players, somebody is bound to draw a non-elite enemy, which cannot spawn at your location. So it will get shunted to a neighboring location. All the non-elite enemies will get shunted to an adjacent location. So by doing so, Ashcan has taken one action to play the barricade and potentially saved you how many actions? Having to either engage the enemies that engage with other investigators, evade the enemies that engage with other investigators, or fight the enemies that engage with other investigators. Those can be very action-intensive things. And so Ashcan sacrificing one of his actions and possibly shunting 1, 2, 3, 4 enemies off to the side and not having to deal with those for the following turn is very nice indeed, especially in multiplayer. If you draw multiple enemies, say one of them you get like an elite and a couple non-elites or something, those non-elites will get shunted away, and then your group can deal with the elite enemy. So instead of having to deal with 3 enemies, now you have 1 enemy to deal with. And if 4 players have built their decks properly, you're probably going to be able to deal with that elite enemy. Certainly Ashcan Pete, if he's leaning into Guardian, certainly will have options to deal with that enemy. So I really quite like the idea of playing Barricade in a parallel Pete deck in multiplayer, because it can save you a ton of problems during the Mythos phase. Now, it also synergizes nicely with Pete's guitar, because say you draw one of those enemies during the Mythos phase, it gets dropped at a connecting location. Pete pulls out his guitar, plays Sweet Home Alabama or whatever song Pete knows, and then you get to move that enemy further away. So if that non-elite enemy happened to be a hunter, now it's potentially 2 locations away from you rather than 1, giving your team even more time to get away from it. And the beauty of the card is that the barricade will sit there until one investigator leaves. It doesn't have to be Pete. Any investigator leaves the location, the barricade comes down. But the barricade just pops back into Pete's hand. The group moves on. Pete can drop the barricade again later, and suddenly that hunter isn't getting in, and any other enemies that spawn during the subsequent mythos phase are getting kicked out. So you can really have a nice amount of control over enemies using Barricade level 3. So I think that card is Barricade. I mean, Barricade has seen some play in Min Tae Fan decks where she barricades herself into a location and then just hunkers down and commits skill cards to other players. So now that's might be an interesting pairing that kind of Min deck with an Ashcan Pete deck, who rather than Min sort of stay behind and do that, she can now move. Ashcan can pick up the barricade, move with her, drop the barricade again, and the two of them can hang out, and Min has a little bit of protection and with a moving barricade now. So I think there's lots of really interesting things that you can do with the barricade, and the fact that it synergizes nicely with Pete's guitar means, like, if as long as you're kicking out those enemies to the neighboring location and then you're moving those away, you're basically not only taking care of that non-elite enemy for the following turn, which could have chewed up a bunch of actions, engaging, killing, and or evading it, but you're getting a resource on top of it, which is very nice indeed. So really enthusiastic about Barricade, especially the level 3 version that was released in the Return to the Night of the Zealot box. I'm going to stop and take a quick drink here. So what are your thoughts on Ashcan or parallel Ashcan so far? I've seen that some players in the chat are very enthusiastic about this new ability, and I have to admit, initially I was a little suspect of it, primarily because, I mean, Ashcan is one of the best solo investigators in the game. That's my preferred play mode, and so having a new Ashcan isn't necessarily having an Ashcan that focuses on attach cards, which have been sort of really hit or miss over the lifespan of the game. I was kind of like, well, maybe it's okay, but the more I started to dig into it, I think there's enough there that Ashcan can leverage. Standard Ashcan with parallel back. I haven't actually looked at that closely. So that would be Duke with improvised tactic cards and Guardian. I think you're starting with Duke on the table still, which is very good. You're sacrificing a bit of Ashcan's flexibility in the fact that he can take cards from any class as opposed to just the Guardian class. So it really depends which tactics, I think, you want, considering all the improvised cards are survivor cards anyway, so you're not getting that. So you're really trying to gather tactic cards. But, you know, the fact that you could get, say, I mean, practice makes perfect, plus various skills. I know there's the, I just need to check that. Is the, are the desperate skills, what is the traits on those? I'm just going to check that quickly in case there's something interesting there. I think one of them has the practice trait, doesn't it? No, they're all desperates. Okay, so that's out. Yeah, so that's out. But the fact that you could probably build, you know, enough cards with the practice trait so you could go skills that way. Certainly if you want, I think it opens up the option of being a much more aggressive Ashcan. Like you could use, in multiplayer, you could focus Ashcan more using Duke as an attacker, and then he's now got more offensive options at his fingertips that he can use to supplement Duke's attacks. Now your combat skill is still a bit low, but you could pick up things like Jessica Hyde to boost that, and between that and a pretty good weapon, you've got Duke for an attack. You ready him, you attack again with Duke. You've still got a weapon to use, so you could push out a significant amount of damage with if you were using the original Ashcan front and the parallel back to lean a little more heavily into Guardian than I think Pete tends to lean into. All right, well, let's take a look at some more of these cards that you can include in parallel Ashcan. The other one that stood out to me was On the Hunt. Now, On the Hunt level 0 was released in Black Star's Rise. We received On the Hunt level 3 in the Edge of the Earth Investigator expansion. It's the level 3 version that is, I think, very interesting for Pete. Now, it's a free event, much like Barricade. So again, if you want to recycle this event, you're not spending any resources. And that's the one thing I'm not too sure about the new Pete build is how resource intensive it's going to be. So the more of these attached cards that cost 0, 1 resources, I think that's where you really want to be looking. So On the Hunt is a tactic. Fast, play when you would draw an encounter card during the Mythos phase. Instead, search the encounter deck for an enemy, spawn it engaged with you instead of its normal spawn location, attach On the Hunt to it, and shuffle it into the encounter deck. As a response, when you defeat attached enemy, gain 3 resources. So basically this turns On the Hunt. So first of all, you get to search the encounter deck for an enemy. And it looks like you're searching the entire encounter deck. So if you're looking for enemies that are worth VPs, if you're looking for annoying enemies like the Wizard of the Order, On the Hunt will let Ashcan Pete fetch those. And then you attach On the Hunt to it, so then when you kill that enemy, you get 3 resources. That enemy goes to the discard pile. On the Hunt comes back to your hand to rinse and repeat. So basically, Ashcan Pete, if he's very good at killing things, and you're able to trigger parallel Ashcan's response once per round, you could play On the Hunt during the Mythos phase to pull an enemy, kill that enemy during your turn. On the Hunt comes back to your hand, ready to play again during the subsequent Mythos phase. So Ashcan can always draw an enemy if there's enough enemies in the encounter deck. And since you're searching the entire encounter deck, theoretically, Ashcan can pull an enemy every turn as long as he's very good at killing the one that it's attached to. And of course, you can play 2 of these, so there's nothing saying you couldn't have 2 of these, one in your hand, one on the table, and just sort of cycle through them as you go. And then Ashcan could gain 3 resources for every kill, which goes a long way to solving the resource issue for a survivor. Like I said, they don't have a ton of resource generation other than cards like Take Heart. So having basically an emergency cache on demand with On the Hunt level 3 is pretty nice. So there is some potential, I think, to use. Philomus says losing access to level 4 or 5 survivor cards in exchange for level 0 to 4 tactics seems like an interesting exchange. Yeah, there's not very many. There's only 8 level 4 and 5 survivor cards. And the only 2 that really stood out to me were Chainsaw level 4 and Sledgehammer level 4, which are the 2 big weapons. And since Ashcan can't take high-level Guardian weapons, he's capped out at level 3 survivor weapons if he wants to improve his weapons. Now, of course, you've got Duke if you're playing the original front side, and then maybe there are there are still some good survivor weapons that I think you could tap into. I don't think you're going to be like a boss killer or anything like that. I mean, you're not using lightning guns and stuff like that, or maul, or what's the hammer, stuff like that, the Cyclopean hammer or anything like that. You don't have access to anything like that. But I think if you're playing a support Ashcan and picking off some of those smaller enemies, that's definitely within your wheelhouse without having to spend XP on a big weapon. So you can say invest in smaller survivor upgraded weapons and then spend XP on things like Barricade level 3, On the Hunt level 3 if you just want to sit there and kill enemies all day. Ashcan is I dare say he's in a better position than pretty much any other investigator to do that, considering he can play On the Hunt theoretically every turn as long as he can kill the things that he's drawing. So that is one interesting option, and the fact that you get the XP for it as well. Now, it's kind of interesting that you could use On the Hunt to pull an enemy. How would you do that? You could use On the Hunt to pull an enemy from the encounter deck. Then you could use Pete's guitar to push the enemy. Then you could go and kill the enemy. So you could get 4 resources if you play your cards right. As long as you sort of pushed the enemy in front of you and then you were going that way anyway and moved into it, engaged it, killed it, that may be a way to squeeze a few extra resources out of it. So getting possibly 3-4 resources per kill sounds pretty good to me. So definitely like the look of On the Hunt level 3 in Parallel Ashcan Pete. So we have a couple of other cards. Dynamite Blast is another one that you could use as well. You've got cards like Hiding Spot and Shortcut as well. Both of these are sort of Shortcut. Sorry, this is Shortcut level 2. Now, one of the weaknesses of Shortcut level 2 has always been that it's fast, which is great. You get to attach it to a location, which is good. And every other investigator you can use that shortcut to move through that location. Unfortunately, Shortcut is locked to that location as soon as you play it. Ashcan can break that. So Ashcan can say, okay, maybe play Shortcut level 2 at a central location. Investigators use it to move around. Then later in the game, Ashcan draws an Elder Sign, which enables him to pick up the Shortcut level 2 and move it to a potentially better location. That is one thing you could do with that. I'm not too sure how often you would need, it would really depend on the scenario, whether you could get a lot of mileage out of moving the shortcut around. Obviously, it's very hard to predict when you're going to be drawing Elder Signs, and so depending on location layout and Elder Sign frequency and stuff like that, you're not really going to be able to move the shortcut wherever you want, whenever you want. But depending on the scenario, I think you could probably get some value out of it. Hiding Spot has always been one of those attached to cards that I really like. It is a great way to get investigators through a very sticky location, such as the main path in the Devourer below, which is potentially packed with cultists. You simply drop a Hiding Spot on it. All of those cultists gain the aloof keyword, and you waltz on through, and you leave the location, and then at the end of the enemy phase, you can discard the Hiding Spot again. This one's a little more situational, but and I'm not too sure how often you would need to play Hiding Spot twice in a game to sort of get through packed enemies. The one that sort of occurred to me would be maybe in something like the Ruins of Etzli, as you're heading down the corridor one way, maybe Hiding Spot through a pack of enemies, and then Hiding Spot again on the way back as you're running for the exit. That might be something worthwhile. But again, both of these are very cheap. They're only one resource. Hiding Spot has the advantage of having 2 agility skill icons, which is also very nice. In case you don't happen to need it, you can pitch it to a skill test. So I think these are also options that you might want to consider, although they are, I think, more situational than the others we've looked at. There are also some of these attached cards that attach to enemies. Now, both Bolas and Grievous Wounds were released in the Scarlet Keys, I believe. Again, these sort of rely on Ashcan Pete's ability to draw Elder Signs or kill enemies, because once you attach Bolas and or Grievous Wound to an enemy, it's there until the enemy dies. Now, with something like Bolas, you tend, like, the after attached enemy moves exhaust it. So with the idea with Bolas is you're sort of going to leave it on that enemy long term to basically hobble it, or hobble that hunter for the remainder of the game. But I could certainly see situations where Ashcan uses something like the Bolas to pin down an enemy. He hobbles that enemy enough that it's no longer a threat. He happens to draw an Elder Sign at some point in the game. He yanks the Bolas back to target another non-elite enemy. I guess the one problem with Bolas is that the evade test isn't particularly easy for Ashcan. I mean, he gets to evade using combat instead of agility, but they're both 3, so it doesn't really matter. So you're probably going to have to commit something to that test to pull off the evade. But if you hit a hunter with it, you could hobble it. Grievous Wounds, again, you're attaching it to an enemy to deal additional damage to that enemy. So with this one, it's definitely going to die, and you're definitely going to get the Grievous Wounds back in your deck. So that might be a way of, in addition to either as an addition to Vicious Blow or instead of Vicious Blow, because Vicious Blow isn't a tactic, so it's costing you 2 of your 5 Guardian slots. Grievous Wounds deals extra damage, but it's a tactic, so it's not counting. So that might be a reason to consider it instead of Vicious Blow. But certainly Grievous Wounds, you're planning to kill the enemy at some point, so you are going to get that back to your hand. And of course, Grievous Wounds does have the 2 combat skill icons, which is awfully nice as well, in case you don't happen to need it anymore. Once you've pulled it, once you've killed the enemies, it's nice to have a couple extra combat skill icons in your hand in case, as you're preparing for the final battle. There are also attached to location cards. We have both Breach the Door and Map the Area. They both kind of do the same sort of thing. Breach the Door, you attach it to the location and it reduces the shroud by the amount you succeeded by on the Combat 1 skill test. Again, this isn't going to be very easy for Parallel Ashcan to do, given that he has a base 3. Jessica Hyde could push that to a 4, but you're not going to be reducing the shroud by much, but it might be enough in multiplayer to give everybody a chance to, if you can reduce the shroud by 1 or 2, then in multiplayer, a lot of investigators at that location can suddenly have the option of investigating when they may not have had before. Map the Area, not that hard for Ashcan Pete to succeed by, considering he's adding 4 to his investigative 2. So he's making 6, which is pretty, he's investigating at a 6, placing this on there and reducing all skill tests, the difficulty of all skill tests by 1. Again, it depends. It is more of a support option for Ashcan, possibly in a multiplayer setting. As long as your group is sort of clumping together more and sort of moving as a unit, you might want to play Map the Area on a location. You're able to reduce, skill tests at that location. And then later in the game, everybody's moved on from the area you mapped. You draw an Elder Sign, you map the area back to your hand. And then maybe you end up at a boss battle at a location. You can map the area there, and suddenly you're getting double use for it. It's just not as sort of neat as some of the other cards we've looked at, because it doesn't these cards don't discard themselves naturally unless that location happens to leave play, which means the board has to reset in some way, or you draw an Elder Sign. So there are some interesting support options, I think, especially if you are looking to play in, if you're building the deck for multiplayer. Of course, you've got good cards, and then I think you've got some bad cards. And unfortunately, I was hoping that Parallel Ashcan might make Ambush worth salvaging, but I don't think he does. I think when you compare Ambush even to something like Barricade level 3, Ambush is going to deal 2 damage to 1 enemy, while Barricade could potentially deal with 4 enemies a turn if you play your cards right. So it just... And Ambush is very expensive at 2 resources. So while you could say set up an ambush, you draw an enemy, takes 2 damage, ambush comes back to your hand to reset the ambush, I just don't know how often you're going to be able to do that if you're shelling out 2 resources a pop. It's just doesn't seem like a very good use of your money when you have other options to play around with. And then we've got Under Surveillance, which came out in the Innsmouth Conspiracy cycle, and it costs 3 resources, which is a lot, and you have to attach it to a location. Then you have to wait for an enemy to enter that location, at which point you get to automatically evade it and then discover a clue without making a skill test, and then the enemy doesn't ready. Now, does this Under Surveillance, I don't even think it discards itself. It doesn't. So not only does Under Surveillance cost 3 resources, but it doesn't discard itself. So you're going to have to use an Elder Sign to pull that off a location, or hope that location gets reset somehow. So yeah, there are, compared to some of the other options available, cards like Ambush and Under Surveillance just don't really appeal to me, because I just don't think, unless you're running some crazy on the hunt level 3 loop and gaining a bunch of resources every turn, I just don't see you having the time to pay for slightly pricier Guardian cards and shell out for these as well. And then there's a whole bunch of other cards that attach to various things. Things like Lure. I believe there's the level 1 version and the level 2 version of Lure that you can sort of attach to a location, run away from that location, and then the enemies will sort of move to that location, and then the lure gets discarded at the end of the round. So you're going to be able to get your lure back fairly consistently. If you're playing the level 2 version, you can attach it to a connecting location, but that depends a lot on the layout of the map. And I don't know whether you're always going to have a good target for the lure. It really depends on how the map is laid out. So that's why I sort of put it further down the list as an option. It is an easy way. It's easy to get back because it's always going to discard at the end of the round. And it does help Ashcan manage enemies and how they move around the board. But I feel like if you're going to spend the XP, I still think Barricade, simply locking the enemies out of your location and then moving the barricade along as you go is a better option than trying to lure them into some weird place. I mean, I guess you could position Ashcan on the board in such a way that he could just keep luring all the hunters off toward him, but that seems kind of like a strange strategy to pursue, and of course depends on drawing a lot of hunters. So besides that one scenario from Path to Carcosa, Phantom of Truth, where you've got a ton of hunters on the table and a large map that you could potentially pull them all over the place, I don't know how viable that is. Snare Trap, again, just seems costs 2 resources, 2 XP, and I think Ashcan has better ways to deal with enemies. Same with Fend Off, it costs 2 resources and 3 XP, and an enemy spawns at your location, you place Fend Off on it, and then that enemy cannot ready. Again, I think you're going to have to use your Elder Sign to pull that off, and there are just better ways of doing it. Shrine of Morai is another one of those weird cards that attach to a location, and then it allows people to like get cards back from their discard pile. Like anybody can get cards back from their discard pile in multiplayer, but sort of you have to put it at a location, then everybody sort of has to huddle there and do it. So theoretically, if you want to play around with something like that, you could draw an Elder Sign and pick up the shrine and move it somewhere better, which might be, who knows, late game, that could be that could win you the game if you move it to a location, you pull it off the table, move it to another location, one of the other investigators at the table uses it to get the cards back that they need to win the game. That's certainly a possibility. But it's not a card I have played with, and I don't honestly know how much play this card has seen in multiplayer, because it attaches to a location and then is basically stuck there. And if the scenario is sort of having you go from one place to another, you're not going to backtrack to go use the shrine. That's just not really worth it. And finally, the other card was Handcuffs. I think there are a couple things working against this one, simply because it is cost 2. Handcuffs, you have to play it on the table first, I believe. Or how does it work? You evade. I don't even know how Handcuffs. I haven't played Handcuffs, but it is not a tactic, so it does count against your Guardian cards, and I feel like just maybe one of those Guardian cards that you're not going to. It's not going to earn a slot in those 5. I could be wrong, but Ashcan can't take the upgraded version of Handcuffs that came out in Edge of the Earth or Scarlet Keys, one of those 2. So that's sort of the rest of the cards that attach, So I think overall I really like cards like Barricade level 3, On the Hunt level 3, Dynamite Blast, I believe, has a level 3 version as well. That doesn't count against Ashcan's his deck. Yep, there is a level 3 version that you can attach to your location or a connecting location, deal 3 damage to the enemies, etc., etc. And it's fast and plays during any free triggered ability window. So cards like that, I think, are more interesting than some of the others we've looked at. I think you might be able to find a spot for things like maybe a hiding spot or a shortcut level 2 or a breach the door or a map the area if you're playing in multiplayer. But outside of that, I think the attached cards get a little too situational to be useful, but I could be wrong. I haven't had a chance to play the new Ashcan build, so we shall see. Any thoughts from chat on Ashcan, on the cards available to parallel Ashcan Pete? So I did sit down and build a solo parallel Ashcan Pete deck. Like I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure the deck lends itself very well to showing off all the tricks that parallel Ashcan Pete can do, largely because you do have to sort of, when you're playing solo, focus on killing enemies, discovering clues, and after that you tend not to have a ton of deck slots for tricksy stuff. So this one was sort of based on a William York deck I saw that, and sort of parallel Ashcan and William York are similar in the cards that are available to them, at least the Guardian way. So I picked up in the thick of it for 3 XP, 2 of which I used to spend on Makeshift Trap, the simple upgrade. So Makeshift Trap plays as a free triggered ability. And I also used 1 of those XP to pick up 1 copy of Jessica Hyde. I would have loved to have picked up 2, but unfortunately when you only have 3 XP, something had to give. But I did include Duke in this deck as well, so having Jessica and Duke sort of as your allies, I don't think you can really go wrong. Jessica boosts Ashcan's fight and gives him some damage soak as well. I threw in the 18 Derringer as the weapon, a couple flashlights to help with clues. You've got the backpack that you can use to fetch your Derringers, your flashlights, stuff like that. If Pete's guitar happens to get shuffled back into your deck somehow, the backpack could fetch that as well, since it is an item. To also discover clues, welcome Sub-Zero Joe, glad you could join us. To also discover clues, there's of course Look What I Found. We've got Lucky, Scene of the Crime. Again, that's really a solo consideration there. Just the ability to discover 1 or 2 clues without making a skill test is pretty important. And then I rounded it out with Able-Bodied, which can be agility or combat skill icons, depending on what you need. Resourceful, of course, to get cards back from the discard pile. Take Heart gets you some cards and or resources if necessary. And finally, Vicious Blow and Unexpected Courage to deal some damage. I have to say that I was disappointed to find out that Pete's guitar does not have a hand slot, or doesn't require a hand slot, which is good. Don't get me wrong. The fact that the guitar doesn't take a hand slot is very, very good, because then, if I'm playing solo, I can have a Derringer in my hand, I can have a flashlight in the other, and I'm good to go. And that's really the ideal setup for solo. If the guitar had taken up a hand slot, then you're put in this position where you can't have a flashlight and a Derringer. You have to pick one, and then it gets awkward. I was disappointed, I should say, though, because you cannot use Act of Desperation to smash Pete's guitar over the head of the enemy, Honky Tonk Man style. That was somewhat disappointing to me. Whoops. I just knocked out my thing. Let's go back. Yeah, so I thought, oh man, you can Act of Desperation his guitar, which has a cost of 2, so you could smash the guitar over somebody, but since the guitar doesn't take up a hand slot, that play is out, which is too bad. So sad. So that is my solo Ashcan Pete deck, or parallel Ashcan Pete deck. I think if you're building a multiplayer deck, again, depending on player count, you can either build a more supportive Ashcan Pete build that's using cards like Barricade to protect the group from enemies and sort of moving the barricade with the group as it moves along. So you could sort of just keep all the enemies behind you and not have to worry about it. Or you can go full on offense and use something like On the Hunt 3 to pull an enemy from the encounter deck and kill it and gain 3 to 4 resources, depending whether you push it around with the guitar first. And then there's other options like breach the door and map the area, hiding spot, and shortcut to that could find their home in that sort of build. So I think that overall, I would say that the response on the parallel side of Ashcan Pete does work. I think it does add enough to some of the cards that attach to either locations or enemies that you could get quite a bit of use out of it during a game. Of course, you've got to draw the cards that attach to things, but if you include enough of those in your deck, you're bound to get one. Now, survivors don't have a ton of draw, so that may be a bit of an issue, but there are ways of sort of thinning your deck with cards like Backpack. And of course, Parallel Ashcan has access to emergency. Man, oh man, it's getting late, and I'm forgetting my words. So he could pull a weapon from his deck if necessary, which is pretty nice. So if whether you're playing with Duke or not, the ability to grab that weapon would be pretty good, and it wouldn't count as against your Guardian deck slots if you happen to be playing the back. So now I was planning to play a game with this deck, but it is smoking hot in this room, and we've been going for about an hour and a half now. So I think I might end it there. Anybody in the chat have any comments on Parallel Ashcan Pete? Well, I think that's going to do it for tonight's stream. I was planning to play, but maybe what I will do is I will play that game tomorrow once it has cooled down. It is smoking hot in here with my lights on, and I am sweating up a storm. So I am going to end the stream there and post the game at a later date, or post the playthrough at a later date to see how things go. So yeah, Parallel Ashcan has some pretty cool options to play around with. I didn't focus a lot on Dynamite Blast. It is quite expensive, but so I don't know how often you'd be able to pull off Dynamite Blast, but if you're cycling on the hunt level 3, maybe you could Dynamite Blast repeatedly over the game and just become a dynamite throwing Ashcan Pete deck. That might be fun to play around with. Yeah, it's nice to see that the designers have brought out another Parallel Investigator. I think it's noteworthy that we didn't get a scenario this time around. We didn't get Ashcan Pete doesn't have his own personalized scenario to go along with his cards, probably because he doesn't have anything to upgrade. Like there's no advanced signature cards that he could upgrade, which is so maybe that will return with the future. With the future Dunwich Parallel Investigators. No idea when we will see those investigators, but I was surprised to see that they released Ashcan Pete, so I guess there is hope that we will see more in the weeks and months to come. And of course, Gen Con is next week, so perhaps, cross our fingers, we'll hear some more news about the next set, which I think is, from what I've heard, it's not coming until next year at the earliest. So we've got quite a while to wait, I think, still. So, but it would be nice if we had a little bit of information, if they could just give us a few breadcrumbs to tantalize us with as we wait for some new information about new investigators and new scenarios. So I will return with a playthrough of the Ashcan Pete deck. Maybe I'll build some. Maybe I'll play two-handed instead. That might be more interesting to see how the deck performs. I'll stew on it and see what I think about that. But thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in to the stream. Glad you could all make it. Thanks again to all the patrons who support this channel. It is your support is amazing and is greatly appreciated. And I look forward to giving this deck a shot here in the days to come. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great night.